Oh, hi, I didn't see you there. So I thought today I'd do something a little bit different, and it's not mixing. So today we're going to talk about production and specifically recording, because few people aren't familiar with how to record good stuff or what it really takes, or what the caveats are or that sort of thing. So I'll just go over stuff very briefly. For starters, experiment. So experiment with your own instruments, your own mics, mic placement, mic distance, mic angle, that sort of thing. For example, with a guitar and a guitar amp, you want to try recording with whatever mic you've got from up close to the grill, a foot away, 2 feet away, maybe even 3 feet away, and try changing the angle, around like that. Also try changing the actual placement, side-to-side placement, so where in terms of the actual speaker itself are you pointing towards the middle of the cone, towards the outside of the cone, etc, etc. That's just one example, but it applies for every single instrument. I didn't have any specific training for recording itself. I just got some mics, had a computer, started miking things, tried different distances, different angles. One way to shortcut this process is to use your ears. Get up close to whatever you're recording, pull your ear in, back, around, blah blah blah. See where it actually sounds the best to your ear, and then put the mic there and see how that is. Unfortunately, the mic isn't the same as your ear. The ear does things slightly differently to a mic. It has all this funny shit around it, and it has, different shape and a different angle of recording. So whatever mic you have, they're all different. They're all going to have different focuses and that sort of thing. So really the main thing I would do, particularly if you're beginning, is just experiment, experiment, experiment. Because it also depends on your room. If you've got a room like this, which is fairly wide open and it's not treated and it's fairly echoey, then you probably want to get closer. If you record from a distance of like 3 or 4 meters, then maybe it's not going to sound so good. But again, it depends what kind of effect you're going for. I've actually recorded in this room. I did a song called Nameless Senseless, which had about 100 vocal parts, and all of those vocal parts were recorded on a little small diaphragm condenser mic with me holding it in my hand in this room. And that's one of my most popular tracks. So just kind of goes to show, a lot of it is about intent, and you can't really second guess things too much. If you have a good idea, you should probably get it down, regardless of whether you've got the top-notch studio there or not. The other point to make is that, some environments are much better in a generic sense for recording. That's why we have recording studios. That's why you should ideally have a room that's reasonably well treated. If not to record in, then at least to mix in. But, you should second guess that sometimes. I think of, what's his name, Tom Waits, with one of his more modern albums. They were recording in this place, and I forget whether it was just sort of semi-treated industrial warehouse or whether it was actually a recording studio. I think it was a studio. But anyway, they're recording and they're doing stuff, and you kind of listen back to it and you went, no, this isn't right. And he said, open that door over there. It's like, what? No, that's to the outside world. There's a road going past there and there's traffic. And he's like, I know. Opened it up a bit. He just wanted to get a little bit more grit and a little bit more noise, cacophony coming into the mix. And if you know Tom Waits and you know his later work, then you probably understand why that is. So odd environments and odd choices can make for interesting recording, and it does depend on what style you're doing and what you're trying to get out of it. as with mixing, your intent when recording should be to A, make good aesthetics, so, preferably make something that doesn't sound absolutely appalling and unlistenable, and B, something that increases the feeling that you are aiming for in your music. And that's what Tom Waits was doing. His stuff is sort of quite scattershot, and that's not the right word, but there's an element of madness and chaoticness to a lot of his particularly later work. So, in the earlier days, the 60s and whatnot, often there was a lot more distance miking, and one of the main reasons for that was that they were recording to tape, and often they were also recording on ribbon microphones, and both of those things have problems with things being too loud, but tape in particular has problems with some instruments when they are close mic'd, like I believe it's brass instruments. If they're close mic'd and they go to tape, something about the timbre of it, I haven't looked into it in sufficient detail to clue you in on the maths, but it messes with the tape and it screws things up. So, there were these limitations. And then you get the kind of 60s sound, particularly for vocals, where everything's sort of recorded at a distance, and it has this it's very noticeable. People have been copying it a little bit more in recent years. It's a bit more of a wide open, I would say, a bit more of a spacious sound. It's not tight and focused like you get on a lot of 90s and 2000s recordings. And that's nice if you've got the space to do it. And what they also tended to do back then was, they didn't have quite so many readily available and high quality hardware reverb units, and they had spring reverbs and stuff, but often they would use the reverb of the room that they were recording in. So you would have special, rooms that were kind of semi-treated to be used for recording with reverb. So we don't do that anymore, but if you do that, then it has a very particular sound. And sometimes there's something to be said for having limitations, right? Limitations force you to go down a particular path, and if you didn't go down that path, you probably wouldn't have made the same choices, and you probably wouldn't have made it to that particular place where you end up. So limitations can be a very good constraint on creativity. It can actually lead to more creativity, or at least, if not to more creativity, then to something that is more highly differentiated than when you've got somebody else who has got all the tools and all the techniques and has no limitations. If you have two people who both have all the tools and all the techniques and no limitations, what's the chances that they're going to end up sounding the same or more similar to each other? It's actually a lot higher, I believe, than if one of them has limitations, because if one of them has limitations, it forces them down a specific path, rather than adhering to whatever their initial choice would have been, which is going to be influenced by whatever's mainstream at the time, and so it's going to be more the same as this guy. So if you ever want to give yourself a boost in differentiation between what you're doing and other people, create some limitations. It's not so fun somehow, but it can become somewhat more fun once you get into it. When I think back to when I had only, I think it was Logic 3 point something, I either had 8 or 16 tracks, I forget which. I think it was 16 tracks total for audio or something. I didn't feel particularly limited by that, but it forced me to be a lot more specific about what I was recording. And that is one of the problems with modern music making, is that you can fix everything in the mix. You can record as many takes as you want. It doesn't matter how crap you are at your instrument. And to be honest, a lot of music that I've made and that I've recorded for other people would not have been made if we didn't have the ability to polish the turd, as it were. For example, my drum playing is atrocious. Absolutely appalling. Just terrible. My timing is weak. So, I do what any sensible person would do when they don't have ready access to a good drum player. And I tend to record about between 5 and 10 takes of myself doing this entire song. And then I do what my friend Rob has subsequently referred to as a Franken take. And I just go through all of those different takes, and I cut all of the bits that weren't any good or that weren't actually matching the timing. And then I look at what's remaining across all of those takes, and then I stitch the best bits together. That is not ideally what you should be doing. But as I said, I suck at drumming. So, and this is kind of an unfortunate thing because it leads people to believe that they can just not rehearse their asses off, including myself in this case, and get into the studio and just, record a bunch of stuff and, it'll be okay because we're in a recording studio, we'll fix it afterwards. No, sorry, that's not going to work. You're under a lot more pressure when you're in a recording studio, particularly if you're not used to recording yourself. You've got people timing you and possibly giving you a click track, and they're looking at you. You're not in a live band scenario, so you're not just playing off each other's rhythm, although you might be recording the whole band at once. And there is a time limit that matches your budget. So, there's a monetary thing on the line. You want to get as good as you can get before you get to the recording point. Now, it's a little bit different if you're like me, or let's be honest, like most of you who are recording at home, and you can just kind of get in front of the mic and experiment a bit. And that's fine too. But I would say that there's something to be said, particularly for high intensity instruments like drums, for actually doing the groundwork beforehand and actually getting something really solid, getting it locked into yourself, and then putting it down. But there's always a caveat to all of these different sides, right? So the caveat to that is the demo take, and you hear numerous instances of people in the recording studio where they're just kind of doing the initial demo take, particularly with vocals. I think this tends to happen a lot more with vocals than with other instruments. But they're just doing that demo take, and it happens to get something that they can't get in the subsequent proper takes. And that's usually because in the subsequent proper takes, the person is too wound up, they're too nervous, they're trying too hard to do something good, and they're not just kind of letting loose. They don't have that looseness inside themselves that comes from knowing that this take doesn't matter. And so there's something natural that comes out at that point that doesn't come out in the subsequent more pro recordings. I would say that's particularly true for lead instruments, things where people are doing a solo, and for vocals. I would say it is less true for stuff like drums and whatever, because you're getting really, with drums and with bass, anything that's rhythm section, you're really tight in terms of timing there. So unless it's a really absolutely stellar drummer, and on every single take, regardless of whether it's a demo recording or not, they tend to just get the beat down pat, I would say you probably end up going with the actual proper takes for those guys. So I guess that would summarize my second point after experiment, which would be that for every rule, there's an exception to that rule, and there's a reason for the exception to that rule, and you shouldn't ignore that. The last thing I would say is, I've already talked about gear and the importance of that, and how it is important and how it's also not important in some respects, depending on what kind of gear you're talking about. Using your ears is of course important when you're recording. The type of mic that you use is also important. If you have a choice of any one mic to use for all of the different instruments in a given recording. Choose a high quality dynamic mic. Don't go for a condenser, because condensers are very specific to different instruments in my experience. Like a small diaphragm versus a large diaphragm versus a mid diaphragm, they all do very stellar jobs on certain different instruments, but they're not so generic in my experience. So I have a couple of small diaphragm condensers which are absolutely stellar on electric guitar and not much else. I have used them for recording vocals, but I prefer the Shure SM7B for vocals nowadays. I find it just kind of gets that placement in the mix better than if I go for something like a large diaphragm condenser. Also, with condensers in general, I would say be very careful with condensers if they have a lot of high-end sizzle. So something like a Rode NTK or a Rode NT1 or something like that, they tend to have a lot of high-frequency excitation, which sounds really good when you first record it. It sounds like, oh, that's really crisp and clear and blah, 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 blah. When you get to the actual mix and you've got all these different instruments competing for attention, particularly if you've used that mic on several different instruments in the mix, you're going to find that that high-end sizzle ends up getting in the way of a good mix down. So, got to be careful for that. I have had a couple of them, a matched pair of Rode NTKs, and then I upgraded them. I replaced the tubes in them with a much better tube, and that did improve the sound quite a bit, made it quite a bit warmer and more interesting. But I still find that they're not terribly good for vocals, and nowadays one of them I use almost entirely on my bass amp, and I hardly ever use the bass amp, I mostly go DI. And the other one I use as a not internal kick mic, but I use it as a behind the kick mic. So quite good for low range frequency stuff with a little bit of snap in it, which is what you want with both of those instruments, but not much else. Ribbons, I can't advise you on. Ribbons, I don't have much experience on. Sorry. Talk to somebody else who's good with ribbons. Ribbons are incredibly uncommon nowadays. They don't tend to see a lot of use, but you do hear people, talk about them for very specific things. Room miking, or let's just say more generically, multi-miking, right? So one thing I'll often do with guitars, I prefer small guitar amps, by the way. I prefer small guitar amps to large guitar amps. You tend to get a more focused sound without so much of the kind of big, bold stuff that interferes with bass. But anyway, what I tend to do is have two mics, put one about a foot away from the grill and another one 2 feet away. And what that gives me is a couple of different distances with a couple of different timbres, and I can choose between them, or I can blend between them. I can phase match them if I want to, and then blend between them, or I can not do that. And I can also take them and pan them hard left and hard right. And because they're at slightly different distances with slightly different timbres and slightly different phases, you get a nice stereo effect like that. You don't necessarily want that for every mix, but it's something you can do. Room miking and multi-miking in general, the general thing is to get a different sound at a different distance and then blend that into the mix somehow. Generally speaking, when we talk about room miking, it's not so much for getting a different timbre as it is for getting that mixed space. So earlier in one of the episodes I talked about how you can use reverb as a way of gluing a mix together. And that's basically by running all of the different instruments through the same reverb and to to different degrees, and that makes them sound like they're all in roughly the same kind of recording space. So room miking is a little bit like that. So you have one mic that is just far away from what you're actually recording and is more or less picking up the reflections like what you'll hear here. And that basically serves the same effect. But even if it doesn't, like even if you're recording your drums in a different space to the vocals, to a different space to the guitars or whatever, room miking can give you a little bit more ambience and make it feel like it's in a space rather than this disembodied kit that just happens to exist there. So it can make a mix feel like it's happening in a space, even if every instrument isn't necessarily in the same space, right? That's probably as much as I have to say on distance miking. I will note one little technique, not because the technique itself is super stellar or anything. You could mimic it incredibly easily nowadays using plugins, but it's more for the fact that it gives you an idea of how you can create creativity in the recording process. Not so much in the mixing point, but in the recording process. So this is David Bowie, and I forget which song. My friend told me about it, and basically the idea was you have one mic here, which is directly in front of his vocals, and then you have more of a room mic back here, and the room mic had a gate on it. So if the vocals weren't going above a certain level, then you would just have the close mic and you'd get that nice tight focus sound. And then when the singer started really bellowing, then you'd get the room mic pick up, and suddenly the whole thing became very ambient and big and spacious. Now nowadays we'd do that in the mix, but there's no reason you can't play around with that sort of thing when you're actually recording. It does require outboard hardware and that sort of thing. But really the point there is being creative. Like if you're doing many different tracks for the same album, it might be tempting to use the same setup, the same mix template, and the same recording techniques for each song, even though that's going to make the recording of the album as a whole fairly homogeneous. So, have you experimented with, singing into the mic, holding it like this where the mic isn't pointed directly at you? Have you tried recording at a distance to the mic? Have you tried recording with two mics at a time? Have you tried recording one song with everybody separate and one song where everybody is playing at the same time, although preferably with the drums in a separate isolated drum room? And, if you do that, if you actually experiment a little bit more, you can end up with things that people haven't really heard before, just like you can at the mixing stage. That's how things progress. That's how music changes, is by people getting creative, not just by emulating what happens to be hot right at the moment, but by pushing the boundaries and getting experimental. So one more example of that, Imogen Heap. If you don't know of her, you should really listen to some of her stuff, because she's a very acclaimed mix artist and mastering engineer, amongst other things. She is extremely good at what she does, and she's a great songwriter. For her second album, she has one song called Headlock. I think it might be the opening track. And there's this low vocal that's going boom, 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 boom. Except it doesn't sound like that. It doesn't sound crap. It sounds great. And what they actually did was they had this massive long plastic pipe, and they put a mic at one end, and then they got the male vocalist who was at that end, and it was just doing these low boom, boom into it. And they got this really weird sort of distanced, reverbed, but also kind of closeted, claustrophobic sounding vocal. It was just a backing vocal, but it's very noticeable in the mix. It really kind of punches through there. And I haven't really heard something like that elsewhere. So, the more experimentation you can do, the more creativity you can do, blah, 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 blah. More you can mix things up, understand your equipment, understand what it's capable of, have limitations. I think of Autechre. I don't know if you know of them. The first 3 albums are worth listening to, the rest of them, depends who you talk to. But particularly for their first 3 albums, they were very much early 90s, had a very set amount of equipment. And, they didn't have much to work with, but they really got to know their tools. And they really cranked stuff out of it. And they really, they actually got into the hardware in some cases and, changed things around. And so they got all these different sounds out of it. And you wouldn't think that it's all the same equipment, but it is. So that's just another example of how limitations can actually force you to do better recordings and better mixes and this sort of thing. So the more creative, the more experimental you can get, I would say the better. And even if you're not doing that, if you've spent some time, if you've put the back effort into knowing your equipment, being experimental, doing different things, trying different stuff, then when you get to a crunch scenario where you're like, okay, I want to do this, I want to do it this way, I want to get this particular sound, then you'll know how to get that. And there's plenty of people online who can tell you how to get X sound and Y sound and Z sound. And that's really cool. And, emulation is good, and you can learn a lot from emulation. I certainly have at some points. But if that's all you ever do, then you will always sound like other people, and maybe that's what you want. But I would say that nowadays what you want more than anything is to be able to differentiate yourself from others, to make people know, okay, this guy sounds different to everything else I've heard, because most of the stuff that is out there now sounds 100% homogeneous and monotonous. Yeah, so that's my points. Hope you got something out of that. Even if it's not strictly mixing related, obviously the better recording you do and the more focused a recording you do in terms of what you want to get, the easier your mix process will be. If you get a crap guitar recording, you'll have to do a lot more work in the mix. If you do a bad vocal recording, you're going to have to do a heck of a lot of EQing and all sorts of jazz in order to get it to fit in the mix. So, none of these things are separate. But I hope that gives you a little bit of insight into how the recording process can be creative, how it can be fun, and how you can use it to create things that you can't necessarily create or fix in the mix. Cheers.